Phone check. 1, 2. The microphone check. 1, 2, 1, 2. The microphone check. I got my headphones tuned between two different AM stations, and my briefcase is full of declassified information. Declassified. Declassified.
Good evening and welcome to News from Neptune for the 15th week of 2015. For almost 25 years, this program has been a spontaneous and unrehearsed discussion of the news of the week and its coverage by the media. First on a so-called community radio station, and when censored and locked out of there, welcomed, I'm happy to say, by the good folks at Urbana Public Television. I'm Carl Estabrook. My discussants tonight are David Green and David Johnson. Our program's name, News from Neptune, was chosen to honor Noam Chomsky, who's been talking sense about American politics for more than twice the quarter century we've been on the air. Chomsky said that in the American media, either you repeat the same conventional doctrines everybody is saying, or else you say something true, and it will sound like it's from Neptune. This and previous editions of this program are archived on YouTube and posted to the Facebook page for News from Neptune, where you'll also find comments from viewers, articles we've referred to, and further comments from us. I also can be reached at carl@newsfromneptune.com, and I'm happy to receive your comments. It's the 150th anniversary of the end of the U.S. Civil War. On April 9th, 1865, the Army of Northern Virginia surrendered to the Army of the Potomac at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia, effectively ending the war. I grew up in Virginia and attended segregated schools during the Civil Rights Movement, and we were carefully taught in those days when the state of Virginia, the Commonwealth of Virginia, insisted on a course on Virginia and U.S. history being taught to all high school students. We were taught to say not the Civil War, but rather the war between the states, to insist upon the justification, if you like, of the war. There was a germ of truth in that, and to have a dissident view was not necessarily a disadvantage. The state was not interested in our talking about the real issues of the civil rights movement in Virginia schools in those days, but it was omnipresent, and we did naturally. It's certainly come time now, many years later, to dismantle the vast propaganda edifice that is the U.S. Civil War in American political mythology. If you ask most Americans what was the Civil War about, they'll say it was a war to free the slaves. That's simply not true. First of all, it didn't do it. A good place to begin with that is an excellent book by Douglas Blackman, published a few years ago, entitled Slavery by Another Name: The Re-Enslavement of Black Americans from the Civil War to World War II. What Blackman describes in there is the way in which the social relations, class relations in the South continued after the war, and indeed were confirmed by the dissolution of Reconstruction in the Compromise of 1877. The second point is that freeing the slaves was not what the war was about. It was obvious to neutral observers then and now that the Southern ruling class simply wished to do in 1860 what British North America had done in 1776. The issue between the North and the South was how the dominant social groups, ruling class if you prefer, and the North and the South made their money. In the South, it was by chattel slavery. In the North, it was by wage slavery, which has rightly been called the equal exchange between free agents, which reproduces hourly and daily inequality and oppression. The differences between wage slavery and chattel slavery were great, but not always in the direction that one thinks. My favorite example has always been the draining of the swamps around New Orleans in the first half of the 19th century. The plantation owners in southern Louisiana had no desire to risk valuable slaves in this dangerous operation, dangerous mainly because of disease. It was the malarial swamps killed most of the people who lived in them. So they brought in poor Irishmen from New York, hired them to do the work that they didn't want to risk their slaves on. Wage slavery and chattel slavery had fewer differences in practice in the mid-19th century than we might think. It was becoming clear, though, that the two systems were incompatible. That was the real meaning of Lincoln's House Divided speech in 1858. A house divided against itself cannot stand. Two incompatible ways of extracting surplus value, as the technical economists might say. But the Northern ruling class was not willing to agree to a simple separation, and they were willing to kill a lot of people to see that the separation didn't happen. One doesn't have to approve of chattel slavery or wage slavery to recognize the U.S. Civil War was, in fact, a war of Northern aggression. Lincoln's choice to attack the South was as conscious as Bush's choice to invade Iraq or Obama's choice in Afghanistan and Libya, and no more justifiable. A month before Fort Sumter, the military engagement at Fort Sumter, on the eve of his inauguration, of Lincoln's inauguration, the leading military figure in the U.S., General Winfield Scott, his generation's George Washington, prepared a memorandum for Lincoln and predicted fairly accurately how the war would go. He said Lincoln could conquer the seceded states by an invasion that would take 2 or 3 years with 300,000 men and would devastate the South for generations to come. Or, said General Scott, Lincoln could say to the seceded states, "Wayward sisters, depart in peace." General Scott clearly preferred the latter, but Lincoln preferred invasion. The federal government, not the southern states, went to war. The historian Perry Anderson is quoted as saying that the Confederacy should have been allowed to secede. Quote, "Slavery was historically doomed in any case." He suggests that Brazil is an example of what would have happened to slavery had there been no war. 2 semi-continental states would have checked American expansionism if there had been a separation of a political separation of North and South. And third, said Anderson, Lincoln was a bloodthirsty Bismarckian etatiste and megalomaniac. Now, that last point, it flies in the face of American political mythology, but it was put forward by as often is the case, by a literary scholar before it was put forth by the historians. I'm thinking of Gore Vidal's novel Lincoln from 30 years ago that gives that portrait of Lincoln. And the historian, William Marvel, whose book Mr. Lincoln Goes to War from 2007 gives plenty of justification for Anderson's calling Lincoln bloodthirsty. Establishing slavery as a Civil War's central issue has fostered an acceptance of the conflict's inevitability amongst academic and popular historians alike. Marvel argues that Abraham Lincoln made armed force a first choice rather than a last resort in addressing the Union's breakup. Marvel describes the president's course of action as, quote, destructive and unimaginative. Lincoln's early and comprehensive infringement of such constitutional rights as habeas corpus set dangerous precedents for future autocratic executives. There is a direct line from the capitalist and imperialist war that Lincoln conducted to those that Obama is conducting today. And for a brief summary of them, see the article in last Sunday's News Gazette under the title of Obama's Wars. In his audition piece for the presidency, Obama's book, The Audacity of Hope, he describes how he wrote in the pages of Time magazine, quote, in Lincoln's rise from poverty, his ultimate mastery of language and law, his capacity to overcome personal loss and remain determined in the face of repeated defeat, in all this, he reminded me not just of my own struggles, close quote. That's Barack Obama on his way to the presidency. The parallel, in spite of what we might think of the psychology behind that remark, the parallel is real in terms of what the American executive has done from the mid-19th century to the early 21st century. Much more important is whom that executive is working for. The historian William Appleman Williams wrote about the Republican Party of Lincoln's time as a political incarnation of the Northern capitalists and agriculturalists. Their descendants are the 1% behind the modern presidency. So you're watching News from Neptune, a War of Northern Aggression edition, where our format is to take turns suggesting stories that have been ignored or misreported, sometimes, if not often, even innocently, in the corporate media, and then ask our colleagues to comment on them. And I think David Johnson, go to David Green first of all. Okay.
Okay. I guess you're implying, Carl, that that Spielberg's movie Lincoln doesn't have a whole lot of value, a whole lot of either historical or sort of ideological value.
It's about as accurate a representation of the American presidency of that time as Shakespeare's play Macbeth is of the Scottish monarchy of his time, i.e. not accurate at all, but a good story.
Okay. Well, having cleared that up, not that I really had a whole lot of doubts, I wanted to suggest the topic of boycott, divestment, and sanctions, not just in relation to the Israel-Palestine issue, which has most often been talked about lately, but in relation to fossil fuels, because I look at the front page of the Common Dreams website this morning and I find that students at Yale and elsewhere are very activist in promoting divestment from fossil fuel corporations as a way of genuinely expressing their alarm about climate change and trying to do something about it. At the same time, last night I saw Ali Abu Nima speak at Channing Murray about the BDS movement, as it is usually thought, in relation to Israel and in relation to corporations that invest in Israel and in relation to the university's divestment. One aspect of that would be divestment from those corporations, especially Caterpillar and so forth. At the same time, I've been doing a little bit of research on what the nature of university endowments are. And I think that is a topic that hasn't been covered enough. Just like a few weeks ago, I was talking about the private equity business and the relationship of that to pensions and how it was poorly understood by me as well as to exactly where that pension money was going, what is being done with it by people like Bruce Rauner when he was in the private equity business. And similarly, I think it's poorly understood when students at Yale protest the investment of the Yale endowment in fossil fuels, exactly what it is they're doing, what the Yale endowment is doing. Well, as it turns out, Yale is ground zero for endowment. They're not the richest endowment. Of course, Harvard is the richest endowment, something like well over $30 billion. Yale is close to $30 billion. And what is it that Yale does with that money to make lots of money? One of the things that Thomas Piketty points out in his book, Capital in the 21st Century, is the incredible returns that university endowments, the larger the endowment, the higher the percentage of yearly annual return, up to 10-15% over a period of time, even in spite of the crash of 2008. Well, at Yale, when I started reading about this, I discovered that there's something called the Yale model. And the Yale model has been going on for 20 or 25 years. I forget exactly how long. Was implemented by a very famous, in that part of the universe, person named David Swenson, who basically made university endowments into hedge funds. Okay, and what a hedge fund is investment. It's a complicated, mathematically and financially complicated investment that doesn't necessarily have a whole lot to do with making the economy more productive, putting people to work, certainly it doesn't have much to do with equalizing income. It has had a whole lot to do with the enormous amounts that both the hedge fund industry and the private equity industry, which kind of overlap in certain ways, have an enormous amount to do with the vast amount of wealth that's been accumulated by the 1%, the 0.1%, or even fewer in the last 30 or 40 years. And that's what's going on with the Yale endowment. And I guess I'm kind of wondering, and I'll continue to sort of tie the Israel-Palestine issue into all this. It seems to me that we need a better understanding of what these endowments are, what the investment is, and what these movements are, what they can possibly accomplish, aside from consciousness raising. When this money is fungible, if Yale divests from fossil fuel, fine, but someone else will buy those stocks. What effect that could possibly have? But the incredible corrupting influence that these massive amounts of accumulated wealth have made on higher education in this country, which the more you read about, the more you realize that universities have become hedge funds. They have become institutions that revolve around the collection of these monies and the investment of these monies, and they're absolutely tied in this kind of circular way to the people who give them this money and the places that money goes. It's charitable only up to a point. It isn't really charitable. It's part of this system of accumulated wealth, and of course it's turning public, beyond the private universities like Harvard and Yale, it's turning public universities who have to compete for these funds and compete in investing these funds. It's turning them into the kind of neoliberal corporations that we talk about frequently on this program. So I'm kind of thinking that we need a much more radical approach to understanding the tactic of boycott, of either divestment in relation to fossil fuels or BDS in relation to Israel Palestine. It seems like perhaps at the most radical way, what we need to be talking about is boycott. And when we talk about boycott, we need to talk about looking at these systems and how they're operating and how the people can begin to boycott these systems. I mean, Noam Chomsky, in criticizing academic and cultural boycotts, often says, "Why are we boycotting Israel? Why don't we boycott ourselves and our own government?" And I think the question becomes, at the university level, why aren't students and faculty members simply boycotting, thinking about boycotting, in a sense, going on strike against this system, which obviously has much more profound and fundamental problems than can be addressed by a particular boycott or a divestment movement.
Thank you, David. Comment, David, on this?
Well, let's see. Going back to your analysis of the Civil War, Carl, I would like to recommend, for the viewers, a really excellent book about this topic by writer and activist, African-American writer and activist W.E.B. Du Bois, which is Black Reconstruction in America. It's a very interesting book showing what the relations were between African slave workers and European American so-called white workers, both in the North and the South, and basically how after the Civil War with Reconstruction only changed things initially for a little bit, but then within a very short time, the old power relationships returned to the South, in particular when the Union troops left the South to put down labor unrest in the North, this particularly the Great Uprising of 1877. So yeah, very good book on that topic, and it was interesting too that it seems like a lot of why the Civil War was going on. That one thing that really collapsed the Southern armies was basically a general strike amongst the plantation workers. The closer the Union Army came to any area where there were plantations, the slaves on those plantations would, basically run away in mass numbers, basically taking away the economic ability of the South to feed and supply its own troops. And very interesting books. Goes into a lot of topics on this. Goes back to actually the 1830s and 40s, prior to the Civil War. And in essence, how the ruling class of both the North and the South were able to manipulate workers to basically pit them against each other. Because in addition to African slaves, of course, Carl kind of alluded to this, there were a lot of European slaves. Basically, they're called indentured servants. But there's some interesting photos of where I can't remember the Union Army general who occupied New Orleans. But there was a photo I just discovered recently where it shows that has his name on the caption about freed white and black slaves in New Orleans, and it showed a photograph of both African American and European American young people who were, I guess, freed from this plantation. So I guess there was still indentured servitude going on even into the Civil War, even though technically it was supposed to be illegal. Back to David's point, this all comes down to control of our money. I mean, this is the thing is, most of the universities are public institutions. And why should, a bunch of unelected people control public funds to basically strengthen the corporate sector and further enrich the wealthy, especially when a lot of these investment activities are actually to the detriment of the general public at large. Environment, labor laws, labor standards, you name it. So yes, this is, I think, something very important, and I think we really need to go and look a lot more closer at how public monies are being used to actually harm our greater society at large.
David, I know you have more things in mind for the improvement of the hedge fund model in American universities, but would a so-called Tobin tax, the Robin Hood tax, would that be a step in the right direction?
Well, I mean, it's not addressing, it may address the problem of the somewhat out of control nature of the financial industry. It may, and of course, as Rich Whitney pointed out in his argument for that when he was down here a couple of weeks ago, it would certainly help the state budget. It would disappear the state budget deficit and prevent us from sort of poor-mouthing ourselves the way and impoverishing ourselves the way we have been. But the financial transactions tax, and it would. The idea of that would be it would limit it may modify the manner in which trading goes on. I mean, I'm getting in beyond my expertise here, but it would sort of slow down this kind of frenetic turnover of trading that goes on, or put some sort of disincentives to that. But I think at a more fundamental level, it's the system itself. It's the sort of the manner in which this Wall Street banking, post-Glass-Steagall private equity hedge fund system has evolved sort of on its own. It's just taken the wealth of this country. It's taken the surplus, let's say the surplus value of this country, and just manipulated it and gambled it and speculated with it in ways that are beyond any possible process of democratic accountability, to which you have. In a sense, Noam Chomsky always refers to a guy named Thomas Ferguson, a political scientist who talks about the investment theory of politics, which we well understand how elections are basically bought. Well, in higher education, even in public higher ed, we can see that with all these vast amounts of money and these endowments, even at a public university like the U of I with $2 to $3 billion, that has an enormous influence in terms of donors, in terms of how that money is spent, in terms of how the university is being governed. So, at a fundamental level, the manner in which this money has been accumulated has been profoundly against the public interest even beyond the fact that the manner in which money is invested in private equity and hedge funds, as David referred to, as maybe I referred to before, isn't what we think of as investment in a productive way, in terms of doing the things that make workers and families' lives better, that make us more efficient workers. None of that. I mean, very little of what goes on Wall Street has a whole lot to do with that. And the sort of the epitome of that is this phenomenon of corporations using their profits to buy back their stock to raise the price of their stock, to enrich the shareholders. That's the model that's operated now. It has nothing to do with reinvesting. When the average person thinks of money being saved at any level, whether at personal level or the corporate profits, they think of savings equals investment, equals building at the public level, building a road, at the private or educating somebody, at the private level, buying new capital equipment to help workers to produce more efficiently. Well, very little of what investment goes on, of these billions and trillions of dollars of investment that goes on, has anything to do with that. And that's perfectly consistent with the fact that so much of that wealth is accumulated into so few hands.
The interesting contrast that's developed just within the last year between American universities and European universities, in that more and more of the latter are becoming tuition free. Generally in Europe now, there is no charge for attending university, and in fact there are grants for living while you attend the university. In America, in contrast, student debt that students take on in order to go to college and university now exceeds credit card debt in the U.S. I mean, this is quite remarkable. What's happening? Why do we have this contrast between European and American ways of dealing with this?
David J., did you want to?
Yes, indeed. About that in particular, I mean, unfortunately,
you have a daughter about to go to college, so it's particularly on your mind, right?
She chose not to go to college for the simple fact that it's too expensive. She doesn't want to become, a debt serf, if you will, the moment she gets out. And there's no guarantee. And the way the job market is for recent college graduates, they have the highest unemployment rate out there. I mean, it's not uncommon to even have people with masters and occasionally PhDs working at Starbucks or somewhere. The jobs aren't there. I mean, it's all about more of a system of who you know, and it doesn't guarantee you anything. So it's a huge risk, and it's a shame because, frankly, I think a society ideally all education should be free, based from preschool to the PhD level. Let whoever let the grades determine whether or not you can go, as opposed to the financial ability of your parents to pay the bill. And it would make it, I think, also encourage every member of society, regardless of their current education level, to always have an opportunity to expand their knowledge and improve any kind of skills or anything education related. That should always be an option for people. This would just not only help the individual, but make for a much better society in general. Going back to what you were saying, David, about in particular the educational institutions and their endowments. One thing I advocated some 15 years ago with trade unions in the United States, with the American unions. 15 years ago, and I did some research, at that time, the combined American unions had over $3 trillion in assets that they basically invest in various pension funds and everything else. Now,
just like universities.
They're not doing anything strategically with all this money. Can you imagine if the unions in this country would get together and pretty much appoint a team of financial advisors and governance that would be elected by the membership to basically strategically use that $3 trillion, how much for the better things could could change in this country politically, instead of just turning this is what union officials do with pension monies. They just turn it over to these Wall Street financial managers who invest it in anything from Walmart to British Petroleum to Citibank. And instead of doing that, they should be focusing their money on helping to create a public bank, state-level public banks, or even eventually maybe a national public bank. They should be investing in wind and solar technologies to create new jobs, sort of a Green New Deal. And companies like Walmart that are horrible as far as how they treat their workers and pay their workers, they should use their collective power to try to undermine those companies until they change their policies. Or even better, help give loans to new starting worker cooperatives around the country. So I mean, it's a matter of who controls our money, because most of it is our money, either directly or indirectly.
Another example of capitalism and democracy being not compatible, but in fact contradictories. Democracy in theory is one person, one vote. Capitalism in fact is $1, one vote. And therefore the amount of dollars that you control, whether you're Harvard University or a hedge fund or the United Steelworkers, determines the influence you have on the society. So long as investment decisions are not made democratically, so long as we don't all have input into what the society is going to spend its wealth on, there is no way that the system will not be run for the benefit of the few, of what we call the 1% today, and not the benefit of the majority. The mythology has us believe that these are compatible. That the interests of the majority and the interests of the 1% are simply a matter of scale or something of that sort. In fact, they're contradictory. So long as investment decisions are made in boardrooms in New York, it really doesn't make too much difference whom you vote for, because whoever you vote for will end up working for those folks who are making those investment decisions in New York. It's a system that is creaking. It's producing a distress in American society that's becoming palpable. And the task of our political leaders is to keep the lid on it, not to let you notice, to stage a sort of political show between Republicans and Democrats and so forth, so that you can say, oh yes, I don't want those horrible Democrats/Republicans, therefore I'll vote for the Republicans/Democrats. So long as you can do that, the system underlying it maintains itself, and the investment decisions are made by the 1%, and the society runs in a way that leads to the immiseration of the majority and the vast profits of the tiny minority. All the income gains, almost all the income gains since the 2008 financial crisis have gone to the 1%, not to the community as a whole. That's a pretty good system. It's a pretty good system if you happen to belong to that 1%. Their big problem is keeping the lid on, not letting the rest of us understand what's happening, and not giving the rest of us a chance to say, I don't think I want to do it that way. I'd like to do it that way where we do have free education through university. I'd like to do it in a way where there are supports for food, clothing, and shelter for the majority, where homeless people do have shelter, where the foreclosures that occurred as a result of the 2008 crisis are actually taken care of in the way that the Democrats said they were going to and didn't. This is the sort of thing that we need in this country, but to do it, we need a self-conscious politics on the part of Americans, and that doesn't seem like happening. The control of the debate is vital, and that seems to be in the hands of our masters. You're watching News from Neptune, where we bemoan these things, and occasionally we even suggest what might be done otherwise. Gentlemen?
I don't know if you wanted to open a new topic, David,
Yes,
or
sure.
I could finish up just maybe one comment on what
Perfect, sure.
was just said. Is this again, it's a matter, I just want to emphasize this to make sure that I've gotten some of the ideas across that I think are most important. When you go to buy a stock, you're not investing in anything. Okay, that stock has been issued sometime in the past by a corporation that went public. It got the money on its first offering, and after that, those stocks are bought and sold depending on how the profitability of that company is perceived by investors. But you're not necessarily investing in what that company is actually doing. So I think these things just need to be understood a little better so that we can begin to think of investment in more of a broad way. Especially, I think you're right on point, David, in talking about public banking, in which the money that is invested, that is kept in that bank, can go out to do things that actually help people. But when you have all these hundreds of billions and trillions of dollars sloshing around in the hedge fund market, the private equity market, and all these complex financial instruments that you hear about, and that you're supposed to on the one hand, you throw your hands up because you don't understand them, and it's hard to understand them. But what you can understand about them is that they don't have a whole lot to do with producing anything that you actually need. And there are a bunch of really smart people. There are people that have developed complex mathematical formulas for dealing with these things. But on the other hand, behind that is a very dangerous investment philosophy that puts the entire system at risk of being very unstable. And that's exactly what happened in 2008. And given the system that we have, given the relative unreality of that system in relationship to real productivity and real wealth, I think I would guess, I would make an educated guess that it's inevitable that there's going to be another crash, whether it's in a year or 5 years or 10 years. There's nothing happened to the system to address how unstable the system is under this sort of financial capitalist system, that we really, again, have to think about radically overhauling not just the level of how we invest money, but if we invest money, or what investment even means in both the public and private sectors, and how all that relates to actually what people produce and how people live. And the whole system has taken us far away from any possible understanding of how all this Wall Street stuff relates to what actually happens to us, except that we go further into debt, whether we're students, consumers, whatever.
Now, is there a sense in which the prospect of another crash is hopeful? Thomas Piketty, whom you mentioned a moment ago, David, in his book Capital in the 21st Century, suggests, a major theme of the book, is the tendency over centuries for capitalism to produce a concentration of wealth in fewer and fewer hands, and to do it at an accelerating rate. And the only thing that stops it are crises. The Great Depression is a crisis that stopped it. The Second World War is a crisis that stopped it. And Piketty suggests that in the absence of an attempt to deal with that tendency to concentration, dealing with it by things like wealth taxes and so forth is what he suggests, that the best we can hope for, so to speak, are crises that produce a relative equalization of control of wealth. What is this? Is this gallows humor?
The question is whether people can organize themselves in the midst of crisis to do constructive things, to deal with these things. And that might be possible, but people will have to be prepared to know what might be done. Like, for instance, in the last crisis, the banks should have been broken up. But Obama went in very, very firmly and said, no, the banks will not be broken up.
Suggests who he was working for, right?
Yes, exactly. So I think it's a little problematic to sort of either hope for a crisis or wait for a crisis in order to make change. I think we should be proposing changes that could be made anyway through democratic political and popular political processes. But yeah.
Yeah. So what party do we vote for in order to get those
I
changes?
can't imagine it. It probably
Republicans, Democrats,
something to do with
Libertarians?
to do with my last name. I don't know.
You suggest there is such a thing as a Green Party that's talking about some of these
There
things,
is,
huh?
yeah. Yeah,
We
I
have-
think we're beginning to talk about some of these things.
We have an example of that here in Champaign County, where where the Green Party of the United States, the local chapter of the Green Party of the United States, has recently been refounded, in part by efforts of people at this panel, there are a lot of advantages, it seems to me, to introducing the sorts of things the Greens have been talking about for a while into the debate. The Green Party, as the name implies, started off indeed as an environmental party, but it's gone in the direction of the problems that David Green has been talking about tonight. I'm happy to say that it does have an incarnation here in Champaign County as the Prairie Greens that David Johnson has been particularly active in working on a platform for. So you'll see, I hope, some more examples of the issues that you've been hearing about tonight discussed in political campaigns to come. The task of political parties as they exist at the moment is to prevent that sort of discussion from taking place, to put a limit to allowable debate that doesn't raise any of the issues about the way in which wealth is used in the society. The Greens want to change that, and it seems to me that there's at least a possibility of making some sort of changes in that direction. Comments, David?
Yes, I mean, in essence, you boil it down in a nutshell, we want democracy and peace and prosperity. And the problem is we're going in the opposite direction of that year by year by year. And the problem is, I think, just with the very nature of capitalism itself, as Carl alluded to, capitalism is getting, it's in a crisis because there's not enough products being bought. There's not enough money being invested in productive activity, as David alluded to. All these, it's basically a system of gambling on exotic investment interests. It's basically big Ponzi schemes, and I dare anyone to prove otherwise to me. If you look into it, you can see exactly how debt is sold, repackaged, and sold as other debt, and it just keeps going on and on. It's just betting on bets of previous bets, and it just, in essence, it's a problem of too few people with too much money not knowing what to do with it and wanting ever higher returns, insatiable greed in effect. And this is the problem. This has to be, we've got to change this because it's leading to environmental destruction, world war, impoverishment of the people. It's just getting worse and worse. And the capitalism is looking for more and more investments to the point now where they're trying to cannibalize the commons, so to speak, the public sector. They want to privatize education. They want to make sure that there isn't any kind of public health care system. They'll stop any efforts to try to get a single-payer Medicare for all system, and even further try to make that system even more corporate dominated to where pharmaceutical prices will be able to be raised even higher, and it goes on and on. I mean, there's not one area of the public sphere except for maybe the military and the police that they don't want to privatize. In fact, I would say that they've already started with the military with these, and I'm not going to call them contractors, they're mercenaries.
Right.
They're cold-blooded professional killers, and they are basically companies like the former Blackwater, which now I believe is called the Academy or something. They've had several name changes, but nevertheless, I mean, this has to stop. I mean, for the future of ourselves, our children, our grandchildren. What kind of world are they going to inherit with this current rate? Because it's leading to nothing but destruction and impoverishment. And one of the things that's coming up on the horizon that is going to make things even worse is the thing called the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Now, you're going to be, actually it's already started, and you're going to be seeing more and more of this, but President Obama, along with some corporate Democrats in the U.S. House and the Senate, and some corporate Republicans in the U.S. House and the Senate, are going to be they're mounting a huge public relations campaign to try to convince you that the Trans-Pacific Partnership's the best thing since sliced bread, that it's going to create more jobs, et cetera, which is actually the exact opposite is going to happen. And even worse, it's going to undermine the very foundation of our democracy, not even just at the national level, but even at the state and local level. The problem with the Trans-Pacific Partnership that's been negotiated in secret for so many years, for quite a few years now, and even members of Congress can't even get a hold of the copy of the treaty that's been negotiated. I mean, this is how frightening this is. What has been known, or what has been found out, has, thank God, it was by somebody on the inside of the negotiations, leaked a copy to WikiLeaks, and then put it all over the world internet. And we see a pretty frightening picture emerging here, basically a worldwide corporate coup. And what I mean by that is to where corporations will be even further empowered to basically undermine every aspect of our democracy, even at the local level. How they'll be able to do this is that they'll actually institute a corporate trade tribunal, which will allow foreign corporations and domestic corporations to sue local governments if they don't like their laws, as well as state governments and national laws. If they don't like their food safety laws, environmental laws, consumer protection laws, labor laws, and if that they can basically say, they can take a case and say that these laws are interfering with our ability to make a profit, and therefore they'll be able to sue for all potential profits lost. I mean, think about that for a moment. Not getting damages, supposedly, that would anything that cost them money, but basically to be able to sue because these laws will prevent them to be able to make the potential money they thought they could. Now, what this is going to do is forget about elected officials being able to do anything for the benefit of the local community or the state. Forget about even voter referendums. They'll be all null and void because trade treaties that are negotiated, that basically are passed into law at the national level, become the supreme law of the land. This is going to undermine our standard of living. It's going to undermine our food safety, environmental laws, consumer protection laws, and it's going to lead to basically further along to a system of corporate feudalism. And I'm not using these words lightly. You need to go and do some research on the internet about this. But anyway, there's several Democratic congressmen and senators opposed to this, as well as Republican congressmen and senators, because what they find is that this is a great infringement on our national sovereignty. And not just national sovereignty, state sovereignty, local sovereignty. So don't believe the lies on this. Call your congressmen and your U.S. senators and tell them, do not allow fast-track authority to be given to President Obama to pass this agreement, because it also, with fast-track, it will allow no debate and it will allow no amendments to be added to the bill. So please realize this is a real threat. Things weren't bad enough. This is coming along, and you need to contact your member of Congress, U.S. Congressman, and U.S. Senator and tell them, no excuses. Do not vote for this bill, or I'll make sure that you're not reelected next election period.
We should mention, too, that the Trans-Pacific Partnership is paralleled by an arrangement for the Atlantic, really, at least for Europe, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, which is in the wings, so to speak, while the Trans-Pacific Partnership is on the agenda. Metaphor is too mixed to deal with, so I'll simply leave it. The point is that the American government is working for the American 1% to establish these international economic agreements, for which NAFTA, the North Atlantic Free Trade Agreement, was an example in the Clinton administration, to move directly into corporate control beyond any possibility of democratic manipulation, democratic input in any of the countries involved. This is a conscious, calculated program, a present incarnation of neoliberalism as a governing theory of American business for years now. It's a culmination of the attempt to establish this sort of independence and control for the American 1%. It should be a matter of public discussion, and it's seems to me particularly indicative of what's going on, that the Obama administration has worked so hard to make sure that there is no public discussion of it. And we're supposed to wake up one morning and find that the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the European parallel to it have been produced as law while we were sleeping. It is time to wake up on this issue. This is very serious indeed. One more connection here. When we talk about what the administration is doing in foreign policy in relation to Iran or in relation to Russia, we should be aware that this is the situation in the background, that in these matters as well, the administration is working for the 1% vis-a-vis Iran and vis-a-vis Russia, and where we hear splendid noises about how the U.S. is standing for opposition to nuclear weapons in the Middle East, or the America standing against Russian aggression in Ukraine. What we're hearing are vast lies, fantasies about what's going on in politics, rather than an account of the American government pursuing the interests of the 1% in the Middle East, where control of energy resources has been a cornerstone of American policy since the Second World War, and the attempt, in fact, to prevent economic rivals emerging in Eurasia, particularly in terms of a Chinese-Russian alliance that would limit in any way the sort of economic control that the American 1% has operated in the world at large since the Second World War. So when you hear about the news from Ukraine or the news from Iran, and it's couched in terms of how the United States is pressing for peace and freedom in these areas, remember that there is a background of these issues, a set of interests, goals, and policies that the U.S. government is following that has nothing to do with the ideological structures, nothing to do with the idealistic structures that are being put forward by the American government. There's nothing new about this. Read George Kennan's advice about what the U.S. needs to do in the post-war, post-World War II world from 1948. George Kennan was a leading liberal planner in the American government in the post-war period. He headed the State Department planning section and produced an account of the sort of control that the U.S. needed to exercise around the world to, as he puts it, maintain the disparity between the wealth of the United States, which had about 50% of the world's wealth and 5% of its population at the end of World War II, and the wealth of the rest of the world. Well, this is a structure for American politics that doesn't disappear. And the sorts of things we've been talking about tonight in terms of what America is doing has an immediate effect in these direct political things in the matter of killing people. The U.S. support for Saudi Arabia's war in Yemen, the U.S. attempt to control the events in Ukraine are directly bound up with this desire, this need, this policy of economic control of the world at large that has been at the heart of Americans' interests since the war. There's a remarkable consistency here. We keep thinking that, well, there are variations from administration to administration in terms of foreign policy, and there are indeed tactical variations, but the overall strategy remains very much the same, and the goals remain much the same, and they are not the goals they tell you about. It's not peace, freedom, and democracy that we're producing around the world. It's the profits of the 1%. And until we understand correctly that that's happening, we don't know as Americans what steps we need to take about it. We don't know what's being done, and therefore we don't know what has to be done by us in order to change it.
I'm reminded of the only reason we had a debate over NAFTA in 1992 is there was an eccentric third-party candidate named Ross Perot, who was opposed to NAFTA and made his comment about the giant sucking sound of jobs leaving the United States going to Mexico. But the ideology then, as it is now, is that there's something magical about trade. It's like the classical idea is that one country does something it's good at, the other does something it's good at. They sell things to each other, and then everybody's happy. Well, you clearly could see that sending jobs to Mexico, sending American industrial jobs to Mexico, and telling Americans that they were going to get even better jobs in high tech, that was just a fantasy, and it certainly turned out that way. And so here, more than 20 years later, what we have is this ongoing sort of border war and drug war with Mexico, while Mexico itself kind of implodes under the weight of all that. So, no matter how much data we have about the problems with NAFTA, they just keep moving forward.
Yes, and I'd like to say I remember distinctly when that was all going on, the debate. I don't know how many people I argued with. Of course, the people I argued with, all they were doing was repeating the corporate media lies they heard on the television. And I predicted at that time, I said it's going to be a loss of jobs, and it's not going to be any good for the American economy. They're not going to be producing more jobs. There's going to be far, far fewer. Well, this is exactly what happened. Sometimes I hate being right. But basically, we lost 20% of our manufacturing jobs. These were good-paying union manufacturing jobs, and some non-union that paid relatively close to union scale. And in addition to, it was like in the actual numbers, close to 2 million jobs that were lost, good paying jobs with benefits. In addition to that, it caused a downward pressure on the remaining manufacturing jobs to where now, in real terms, manufacturing jobs paid 20% less than they did in the early 1990s. What's really interesting is, like for instance, say car manufacturing, or clothing, whatever, car manufacturing that was moved to Mexico, basically jobs that were done by American auto workers that were making like $20 to $25 an hour were shipped to Mexico, and Mexican auto workers were making $1, $1.50 an hour. Well, it's not that much cheaper to live in Mexico, number one. And beyond that, I didn't see the price of automobiles go down that significantly. So where did that extra money go? It went right in the pockets of the 1% and the corporations. Meanwhile, living conditions and labor conditions in Mexico have just deteriorated further. I believe that I would like to see the working people all over the world have a sustainable, productive livelihood to where they never have to worry about housing, food, medical wants, and or education wants. And it's basically possible. It's entirely possible. But these corporate trade treaties, they want to push the living standards of the world, all working people. And if you're, don't think that workers are just blue collar. If you're getting a salary, you're a worker. I don't care how skilled you are or how well educated you are or whatever. If you receive a paycheck from somebody, you're a worker. In fact, if you're self-employed and pretty much just you or maybe one or two other employees, you're still a worker. Understand this, and these corporate trade treaties are going to do nothing but further push down our standard of living and enrich the already wealthy.
You've been watching News from Neptune for the 15th week of 2015, a War of Northern Aggression edition, in which we suggested that the victory of the North 150 years ago in the American Civil War was in fact connected with the triumph of American capitalism that is continuing throughout the world and is indeed the source of the fact that the United States is, as Martin King said, the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today. I'm Carl Estabrook. My discussants tonight have been David Green and David Johnson. Our thanks to our director-producer, Jason Liggett. Upcoming programs here on UPTV include Labor's Worldview, Sunday at 4 p.m. with David Johnson, and more news from outside the bubble, as Harry Shearer says, that you can't hear elsewhere in CU. Inshallah, we'll be back next week with a new edition of News from Neptune to remind you, in the words of Edward de Vere, what's past is prologue, what to come and yours and my discharge. In the meantime, confusion to our enemies, and a good night to you.